of the things that, that's useful for us as we go through this, this series of free schools is that I had this lovely discussion with one of our longest, I'd say, members in Diva for Equality in our constituency. And they were talking about when they first started, coming along to sessions, they really, in the beginning, sometimes in the first session, had very little idea of what we were talking about, but just let it wash over them. And then, as the days and the weeks and the years roll by, then we're learning a shared language of the work that we do together, and then also ourselves become knowledge sharers and teachers. And so one of the ways that we do that is to take some of the concepts that we're building on in every single free school, and so it becomes a really a way of communicating with each other and hearing that shared language and hearing the feminist concepts over and over again around the different topics. So, so we're going to recap and add on some of the things that we've been doing in Freeskool 1 and 2. And then, as we said, after that, we will have the session from UN Women, and then Viva and I are going to come back and have kind of a little dialogue just from the work, based on the work that we've done, and then we're going to open up to the room, and as many people as want to contribute to the discussion on elimination of violence against women and SGBV will do that, and remembering that we also have the 2 hours on Friday Fiji time from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Which is a closed session, and there's no recording of that session. So please keep that in mind as well. So again, going back to, this thinking that we did together in both Freeskool 1 and then in Freeskool 2 as well, finding a definition that works for us, and finding a practical way to get it moving in our heads, in our hearts, in our hands and legs as we do our practice work. Characteristics. So we've been very clear about this, and we've been very clear that that means that we have to look back at many of the systems that that stop us from being fully who we are, and as we're creating these new worlds, that we make sure that we're thinking about these definitions and making them for ourselves as feminist social movements. And that's really what this is about. What we've heard very clearly from all of you, but also in social movements, including our own, is we want to do our own thinking and our own analysis, and we don't want to just get told from outside what a definition is. So that's what we're really trying to do, is introduce some of those conceptual frames, those ideas, that thinking, that feeling, and then people go out in their own works and make sure that it makes sense in these different contexts. So we said, and this is very important in terms of doing the work on stopping violence against women and girls and SGBV. So sexual and gender-based violence, stopping sexual and gender-based violence. We said that feminism often feels like you're removing cataracts, get that operation on your eyes. But what it does is it also makes your eyes very watery. It makes you, there's a lot of pain that comes with that from seeing in a new way. There's lots of feelings and thoughts that come up while you're often going through these issues, and then you're being introduced to, to new ways of thinking about it and working on these issues, these really deep and important issues. So just reminding us of ourselves to be patient while we're doing this work. And really one of the things that we've talked about is that requires this ability and this willingness to make mistakes. And it requires us to stop being so judgmental about the ways that this work is done. That doesn't mean that we stop you know, the safety issues. That doesn't mean that we're easy on our politics, you know. We often say in feminist movements, this is not a lifestyle. This is a political, social political movement that looks for change internally in ourselves and working with others, and it's looking at changing the world. So that means that we have to be clear and deliberate in our politics, and that often makes us fierce and prickly, but it also makes us wonderful and joyful and all those other things that movement is. So we just wanted to share that part of it, that being in this collective work is not easy, and we're not always going to agree, but this is part of the set of work, particularly on sexual and gender-based violence. And that means that we have to be willing to do this praxis-based approach. I remember when I first went into the work on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics, we used to use the language around sexual minorities when we first started doing it, you know, a couple of decades ago. And I remember going onto a panel somewhere and having, you know, quite a, I don't know, distinguished, they would say, well-known activist telling me off for using the language of sexual minorities. And I was kind of taken aback because I wasn't sure why I was being sanctioned in this public way. And one of the things that I've learned over time is there are many, many sets of work that we've guarded and we've loved and we've honed over so many decades, right? And there is an understanding that we'll try and do the best we can to hold all of those things, all of those ideas and sets of work. But we're going to have times when we do that work where maybe we're not sure what we're doing. And the radical, the most beautiful thing about it is if we can do those sets of work, but be willing to pull ourselves up on our praxis as well, and be willing to critique both ourselves and others, but in healthy ways. And we continue, all of us, to do that work on how to do it better. Because remember, we're living in the middle of patriarchies, and we hold a lot of that patriarchal behavior within ourselves as women and as gender non-binary people and as men who are working on these issues. So sometimes that work, you might be dealing with a survivor, and then you're also having your own struggles, and it might come out in the work that you're doing. So how do you deal with that? And none of us is immune. This is the first thing to say. And then what we've already talked about is, remember, this work on privilege and critical allyship is really important in the work on elimination of violence against women and girls. And it's the reason why feminists like myself and others are always using that language of sexual and gender-based violence, not just elimination of violence against women and girls. Why? Because we know that there are those who are themselves caught up in the oppression and the privilege that comes from those who are heteronormative. If you're in a straight couple and you're living your life in the world, you have a much easier time than do those who are in a queer or in a same-sex or a same-gender relationship. And those difficulties are not small ones. They are the things that mean the difference between whether you can get support and whether the state is willing to work with you. There's all kinds of consequences. Sorry, Cheryl, just the battery. So those systems of both privilege and oppression we have to look at, because often we'll look at the sets of oppressions, but the sets of privileges are also really important, because we can walk around thinking that that work that we do is enough. But you might be leaving out the violence against, say, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, transmasculine. You might be leaving out the work on women with disabilities. You might be doing a lot of work in, say, a capital city, but you're really not looking at rural and maritime areas. I'm not saying that everybody has to do the work in every area. What I'm saying is that if your lens is limited, then your idea of what is legitimate work, what is the real work, can be limited. And so the idea is to expand that and to be able to talk about, is the money getting to the places that it's really required? Does everybody get the resources? Are we all able to work with the government in the way that we would like? Are we able to work with the UN in the way that we would like? Are we able to work with certain CSOs. There was a time in Fiji, for instance, that there's no way that a group like Diva for Equality was able to work with certain civil society groups, but also that we weren't able to get into government departments. And they would tell you straight up, we're not interested. And I'm sure that is the experience for many, many groups around the Pacific. That's why we're working in this community of practice. So this set of work around organizing oppressions and privileges is incredibly important for us, as well as working with survivors. And I wanted just to, we talked about these almost agreements, right? They're not full agreements, they're contingent. They're about where we are in our context, how we live, where we live, who we are. But we know that the personal is political, and we know that the political is intensely personal. And this is especially true on the work of violence against women. And I would say that actually this is one of the most important parts of the thinking change, the frames of meaning that we've been able to do as feminists on the work to eliminate all forms of sexual and gender-based violence, including violence against women and girls. So if we are saying that, one of the things that we really have to talk about is not letting the human rights frame slip. Because sometimes when we do the work of ending violence against women and girls, for instance, we put a moral argument to it. We might be a faith-based group and we say, oh yeah, but we work with straight women. We don't work with these women. There are particular groups that do and don't access the services. And that's a danger. So that's where we see the slippage in the human rights frame, that we have to make sure all of us are in what we call a values agreement about. That we agree that human rights is by and for everyone. And then another thing that I think we can agree is the autonomous and gender just women-led movements. They can't just be substituted for a technical solution. We need the work of everybody in their different fields, but we've got to be sure that we are protecting the work of women and girls directly in communities, and that includes grassroots community action. And how we work with the state and the UN and the development agencies like PIFS and FPC and intentionally say to them, we expect to be in all of these rooms from the local to global. We don't expect others to speak for us. We expect to have our own voices. So that's really what I wanted to share from these, some almost agreements, that it is about, liberation on all the territories. I mean, freedom from violence is one of the sets of work that is about liberation on all the territories. So, and in order to do that, we have to think about all of the diversity and difference within our region, right? We have to think about the fact that we have 14 Pacific Island states, and that if we think about states and territories, and we have some West Papuans and Timor-Leste and others in this room, and there are coloniality struggles that are still ongoing in Tahiti and New Caledonia and West Papua and many others, a genocide in West Papua. So all of those sets of issues, the amount of state ability to work with you on elimination of violence against women and SGBV is varied, right? And part of our learning this year is really to kind of talk about that. Like I said about the hotlines. Are your hotlines in place or are they not? What are some of the other non-negotiables that we want? And UN Women's going to help us to do some of that work, to really get into that. Part of that, again, we had two slides. One is being clear on who are the crop agencies, the Council of Regional Organizations in the Pacific, because they have a big influence. And we have to be clear. That's why we keep reiterating in every single Freeskool. By the end of this year, be clear on what UN Women does. Be clear on what UNFPA does. Be clear on what Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat and SPC do. Because it's very, very important that we know how to negotiate our way through many of these spaces. And there will be one Freeskool just looking at that architecture of development and really saying, as feminists, what are the spaces that are difficult and easy and why? But on the issue of elimination of violence against women and girls in SGBV, we really have to think about who are the ones who are willing to work with us and in which way as autonomous civil society movements and feminist groups. And some of those civil society groups I mean, we can't, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the incredible, groundbreaking, backbreaking work that Fiji Women's Crisis Center have done since 1984. So they were established in 1984, and then 2 years later, Fiji Women's rights movement. But also in that era, we had YWCA, Young Women's Christian Association, that did some of those really sets of formative feminist work on eliminating violence against women and girls. The Tonga Women and Children's Crisis Center, Ofa Kilevuka, Gutenberg Likiliki, and many others. There's the Vanuatu Women's Center, Voice for Change, PNG, with Lily Basur and many others, V-Pride in Vanuatu, PSGDN, which is Pacific Sexual and Gender Diversity Network with Isikeli and many others, Rainbow Pride Foundation, Viva for Equality, and many, many others. Fiji Women's Rights Movement, I thought I put in there. Okay, so Fiji Women's Rights Movement, and many others. And these groups are cooperating with others that are active in the region and globally on EVO and on SGBV. And they form all kinds of campaign groups, coalitions, networks, social movements. One of the biggest sets of work on elimination of violence against women and girls in SGBV is obviously the Pacific Network Against Violence Against Women. That's, from what I can see, 13 countries and 40 NGOs, and you might hear more accurate figures from UN Women, but also the Pacific Feminist SRHR Coalition, which is 11 countries and over 70 CSOs. But there are others as well that we can talk about. If you have others, please put them in the chat and also talk about them in the dialogue at the end of the session. Now, as always, we really want to make sure that we're talking about the progress and that we're thinking through, it's past 25 years, it's nearly, I think it's 26 now, years past the Beijing conference and the Beijing Platform for Action, this global women's conference that said, these are 12 areas of absolutely critical work that we're going to work on. And obviously, if you look at number 4, and I really urge you to keep reading and rereading this report that has come out from SPC, because it gives us, and there's some really valuable statistics that you can use in your activism and advocacy in this report. But chapter 4 is on violence against women. And if you also look, there's another little arrow down the bottom, and we're talking about the review of the Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration. And as we said, there is a review going on right now, because from 2012, it's now 2022, coming up to 10 years. And there are many, many women, and remember we did a show of hands last month where people said they hadn't even heard of the pledge declaration. So we're trying to change that, and we're trying to say in that pledge declaration is a commitment by the leaders in the Pacific to work to end violence against women and girls. And so we'd like to see how we're really going to see that action and how we're monitoring and evaluating that. Sound good? And a couple of those, you'll get this slideshow. This will go up online on the website soon. We're just getting the website. It'll be up and launched by around May. And all of these slideshows will be up on there. But I just pulled out two of the kind of key quotes in there, because I think they're quite important ones. One of them is the socio-economic, so both the social and the economic disparities, the inequality between women and men, are intertwined with men's power and control over women and girls. And what we know is that's manifested, it's seen in all levels of society, from the private realm, and it's not even private, that's what feminists have been saying, it is a social space, the family to the public sphere of the state. So in every area of work, at how patriarchal control is being used by men to control women and girls and children and LGBTQI people. And how do we shift that? And then in the next quote, I just wanted to say, as the CEDAW committee explains, gender-based violence against women is one of the fundamental social, political, and economic means. It's one of the main ways that the subordinate position of women with respect to men and their stereotyped roles are perpetuated, right? So basically, we're saying that the ways that we carry patriarchy, and we spent a lot of time both in the first and the second session talking about patriarchy, it needs vehicles. And one of the vehicles is the coercion and the control and all of the things that are done to make sure that someone feels like they are not as good and not as big and powerful and wonderful as somebody else. So that's what we're really talking about when we talk about gender-based violence. And then the next slide, I just wanted to, sorry, let me just move this a tiny bit. So I just wanted to say, one of the things that people often say is, I want to do more work, but I don't know where to start. Like we're doing this work on something else on human rights, say, at a national level, but how do we start this work on sexual and gender-based violence and on violence against women and girls? And there are many, many resources and tools, some of them which are being shared through the chat, but also that, you can access those like UN Women, but also that powerful network that's led by CSOs for CSOs, by Fiji Women's Crisis Center and many others in the region. And for us in DIVA, what we did 10 years ago when we started our own free schools, we really were clear that if we're going to be able to do this work on elimination of violence against women and girls and LGBTQI people, that we had to be ourselves comfortable with using some of those terms, right? And really breaking them down. And there's nothing like pictures you've just seen from Lani. That's why I wanted to play it first. Like there's nothing like visuals that allow us to talk to each other as human beings about things that seem both deep and dark, but also that are really important. And so we've taught them visually. This is the way we teach in DIVA for Equality, is there's not those big, painful, words all the time. We use a lot of visuals. And it might be a visual that is about power negotiation, or it's about autonomy of the body, how I keep my body open and my own decision over my body, not what somebody else wants. So autonomy in my decision-making, but also integrity, that I keep the state at a distance from my body, that I keep religion at a distance from my body, that I keep my family in their place over my body, that I am in charge, that the integrity and the autonomy, the decision to move is mine as a human being and as a woman and as a gender non-binary person. So all of those sets of concepts are incredibly important before we start the work. Otherwise we get all sorts of confusion about how we're going to move this work. Okay. So one of the next things I just wanted to touch on is, let's really go to the, this year as we're thinking about this, and as you listen to the presentation from UN Women and DIVA today, and listen to each other on Friday, is let's think about where this idea comes from. And one of the things that we have to talk about is gender-based violence is about violent control. And it's a symptom of a pushback against autonomy of your own body and integrity of your own body, and the consent or not that you give to another human being to interact with your body, right? This is my body, this is your body. Do we have an agreement that we know how we are going to interact with each other? And when you get into the realm of sexuality, then you're touching every aspect of a person's life. How they dress, right? That's what we call gender expression. Their sexual orientation. Who are they sexually attracted to, and who is their love and their affection directed toward? And am I imposing on them and telling them their love is evil because of my sexuality? Yeah. So beneath all of it is this greed, this fear, this anger, and the systems that stop us from freedom as human beings. And we want to be really, really clear on that when DIVA and other radical South feminists are talking about this work, we are talking about it like this. That for us, it's not just about saying, okay, let's stop violence against women and girls. Yes, but let's also talk about all of those things that are involved in how I can be a free and an independent and an autonomous human being. in a world that really tries to stop me from being that, and where I have to negotiate in reality every single day, including us as activists. Many of us, we are doing this work, and then we are also going home, and either we are being beaten in our own homes, or we are seeing others that we love being subjected to it, or we have homes where we really aren't able to be in our own decision making. So we carry that anger and that fear with us, even as we are trying to do the work of liberation with other women and other people in the world. And then the red, we can end it though. We can end patriarchy, but there is severe pushback. And that's part of the work for us to think about real systems of care, real systems. This is not just about, hippy dippy ideas of, lavender oil and everything else. It is that, but it is much deeper about how we keep each other safe in this work, how we keep each other as women and girls and LGBTQI people safe in our communities. What happens when there is homophobic bullying at schools? Do we all help each other with that? What happens if there is a young girl who is experiencing some taunting and teasing as she walks through our informal settlement? Do we feel an obligation to not be a bystander and to step in and to work out a system of care for all of us in that community? How are we talking to men and boys? How are we talking in all of these different sites that are important? Yep. So I'm going to leave that slide now, but to say there is a whole set of work around consent. And I can't do a lot of that work today. Maybe we will do some of that work on Friday. People will talk about consent, but I really urge you to use that massive library that we have online to go and do some work ourselves on consent, that it needs to be clear that if we provide consent, it is clear, that it is coherent, right? That we know that the person has given us consent to do something, that it is willing. So it's not that they're under the influence of alcohol or drugs or anything else, that it is willing, a decision, and that it is ongoing. Just because you have had sexual contact with someone one time doesn't mean that you can have sexual contact with someone the next time. And all of those decisions on consent and on decision-making have to be the way that we move through the world as human beings. And if we don't expect it, then we also will be caught in these systems that oppress us. So part of our learning as women and girls and gender non-binary people, and for men and boys and others, is to do this difficult work on bodily autonomy, bodily integrity, and on consent. Okay. And the last point I'm going to make before we move to this wonderful poem is that physical violence and sexual violence and mental violence, and we're going to go into more detail, I know, with UN Women. We've kind of gone through 2 stages, and we're in the 3rd stage of this kind of work in social movements. And one of the things that we started talking about in the beginning were these cycles of violence and cycles of abuse. And we still do that. You have the honeymoon period, then there's the tension, then there's the explosion, and then there's the honeymoon period again, and these cycles. But what we realized as we were ourselves, as survivors, as women, human rights defenders, as feminists around the world, we realized that there's another set of things that we have to think about. Not only is it about the cycle, but it's about all of those systems of coercion and control that keep it in place all the time, that keep the control and the power and the violence in the home all the time. The walking on eggshells, the economic violence, the stopping someone from having not enough money, the belittling comments, so many things that happen in the course of a household that is experiencing sexual and gender-based violence and all forms of violence. And then the 3rd set, which many of us are talking a lot more now, is to say, we have to talk about the direct connection between the individual violence and the systemic violence, whether it's the economic systemic violence at a global framing, you know, all of these awful extractivist economies that keep women poor, because how are you going to fight for your freedom while you are trying to just survive and get food on the, and water on the table and housing and everything else? So those systems of oppression are very much connected to what is happening in individual lives. So the material and the structural, as we said in the first two free schools, always together, never apart. They work as a patriarchal, heteronormative, neoliberal system that oppresses, and we are trying to kind of break those and build new ways to be together in, you know, in care and trust and healthy living.